My name is Greg Remke, and I direct programs for economic thinking. This is a presentation on the economics of space exploration for debaters considering the potential national topic on the federal government promoting or expanding space exploration. You can see the exact wording on STOA USA, and it's the same wording that the public schools had in 2011 for their national high school debate topic. I held a series of workshops on those and guest talks at schools in various states, and also spoke at the Mackinac Center's for debate workshops for students and teachers in Michigan. So this is an overview of that topic. We have an 8-page study guide on the topic available online at economicthinking.org/space, capitalized space. And you can see that there. We also have a page recommending various movies like Astronaut Farmer, which is a fun movie on space, and other videos that are online that are, I think, tremendous in giving you an overview of how people in the space industry, at least entrepreneurs in the space industry, see the potential now that the sort of NASA monopoly or dominance is diminished, and private firms are competing to develop better and less expensive and rockets to transport people into space. And we'll describe more of that. So in addition to this is the Mackinac flyer for the Mackinac Center debate workshops we held in Michigan. In addition to the public high school policy topic being on federal space exploration, the public forum topic for October, funded or sponsored by the Roop Foundation and the Roop Scholars Program, was resolved private sector investment in human space exploration is preferable to public sector investment. So this, turned the tables. Instead of the private free market arguments on the negative, the private free market arguments were on the affirmative, and then the other side could argue for, let's say, NASA or government or the UN instead. Needless to say, with my economics and market-oriented background, I much prefer private sector investment in space transportation as well as space exploration. But it's important for the public school topic and for this topic under consideration for STOA debaters to realize that the blocking point for space exploration has been the unexpectedly high cost decade after decade for space transportation. It turns out it's more expensive for us to get a payload into space now than it was in the 1970s with the Apollo program. So one of the broader questions is, why hasn't space transportation decreased in cost like air travel transportation has? And that's a great background for the topic. Okay, couple arguments for the affirmative on the pro-private sector wording is that the public sector has no money of its own to invest. It can't invest to expand space exploration. Instead, it has to tax and borrow or print money. Paul Krugman calls for massive federal spending to defend the Earth from aliens. He argues that'll help jumpstart the economy. Whether or not aliens actually show up, it's good for the economy, he apparently argues. And if aliens do show up, we're more likely to be ready. So public sector investment is spending. And the problem is that instead of having public sector investment directed by purely the scholars or entrepreneurs or scientists who have the best insight into the best investments, the money is often sidetracked into a jobs program. So the money goes to NASA centers around the country, and the congressmen from those centers are on the congressional committees that approve the funding, and they see this as their territory. And the challenge is the various private corporations that provide services to NASA, build the rockets, develop the technology. They then donate to the congressmen who sit on the committees that represent the NASA research labs and so forth. So you tend to get a closed sort of an iron space triangle where connections are from NASA people to congressional committee people to the private companies that whose services are used, and they tend to be based on cost plus contracts that ends up making, or at least has ended up making, space exploration and transportation far more expensive than it would be with private involvement. And we're seeing that in recent years as the private sector has stepped in. Space exploration is risky. We don't know the best way to get into space or to explore space, but why risk scarce public sector funds that could be allocated to other services? Would be an argument on the affirmative for this public forum topic, or on the negative for the public pro-government side. The argument, again, that economists make, and this is if you've listened to my overview of the transportation topic, it's basically the same argument. We don't know the best way to get people and goods from place to place, whether it's roads, railroads, airplanes, or underground vacuum tubes. Similarly, in space, we don't know the best way to get people into space. Is it a liquid fuel rocket, solid fuel rocket, space plane, an elevator, all sorts of different technologies, a balloon, all sorts of technologies can get people into space, but which is most reliable, which is safest, which is least expensive for promoting getting the transportation, or getting the things up into space that we're going to do our exploration with. So the argument is the private sector is most likely to discover these technologies. So let me back up a bit and look at the role of contests and competition in space exploration. And again, we have a study guide on this topic where I discuss the history of contests. Contests matter for reasons that I'm going to be discussing, although it's sort of unexpected to hear about it. So the actual wording for the NFL topic, 2011-12, resolved the United States federal government should substantially increase its exploration and or development of space beyond the Earth's mesosphere. So it was the federal government need to do its exploration and development and or development. This, by the way, is a good topic in the news now because of the asteroid that came close to hitting Earth and the asteroid that did hit in Russia. There's lots of these asteroids, meteors out there, and if one turns out to be headed to Earth in a few months from now, we don't have the technology to stop it. And again, we have on our technology page on Economic Thinking a number of different articles on transportation and space technology, plane technology. So let's spend a few minutes exploring exploration. Economics is about incentives, about information flows, about coordination, and enterprises signal through prices and markets. They compete, they cooperate, and they coordinate economic activity. So the economic activity of exploring space is one that involves a series of enterprises, signals through entrepreneurs, discovery process, and it's hard for the state, the federal government, or a government agency to muster the innovation and the drive and the entrepreneurship that tends to come from these competitive markets in the private sector. The idea is in the private sector, entrepreneurs are searching for the technologies that best provide the services. You might think that, well, gosh, space is different. Space is not like opening a new restaurant or building a new laptop computer. It's far more expensive. Well, it's not. It's not more expensive than building a new chemical plant or building a new airplane. Turns out that there are very similar sets of skills and incentives needed. Sound legal institutions, clear property rights are key in developing in the private sector, and you could argue would be key for developing space as well. So we can look at space exploration through the lens of history and look at how exploration's been sponsored in the past. Do we find more success from large state-sponsored enterprises or from small teams competing? Now you could argue that Thomas Jefferson sending Lewis and Clark out to explore the West was a success of a federally funded exploration program. You could argue that the King of Portugal funding Portuguese exploration of the oceans and around in Magellan circumnavigating the globe, things like that were valuable with the European governments promoting exploration. So we have different examples from history of things that work and things that don't work. And of course, in space, the most successful example is NASA, this massive federally government-funded space exploration program that in a sense paralleled the Soviet space exploration program. And the US versus the Soviets in the space race were pushing to show which country, which sort of economic system could best get out into space and get to the moon. We also have more historical examples. One is China versus Europe, and I'll discuss that, how the Chinese government promoted ocean exploration versus the various European governments. We have examples, other transportation-related examples, steamships across the Atlantic, as told in Bert Folsom's book, The Myth of the Robber Barons, the competition of Collins versus Vanderbilt in inexpensively transporting people from the East Coast to London. And then we have competition in airplanes. We have Samuel Langley at the Smithsonian, later founder of the Smithsonian, and the Wright brothers, a couple of bicycle mechanics in developing airplanes. One was state-funded, state-sponsored technology development. The other was a couple entrepreneurs looking for ways to make money and push the frontiers of technology of the time. We have other examples from the R100 and the R101. These were British airships that were looking at breaking in to the steamship business by crossing the ocean and traveling Europe in dirigibles rather than ships. And one was funded by the British government as a way to promote what government could do and the socialist enthusiasm of the time. The other was developed by a small private corporation, and these two technologies developed, and that story is an interesting one that very much parallels NASA's history in a number of ways in the shuttle story, and I can come back to that. Okay, so adventures and exploration. Who explores? Who pays? Who gains? Now, let's say the topic were ocean exploration rather than space exploration. Should the federal government promote ocean exploration? There's various parts of the ocean still to be explored, the deep sea. We have an example here from a number of private companies that are competing in the ocean exploration story. Forbes had an article on liquid robotics, which has veterans from Google and NASA that are out there building ocean robots that are powered by wave motion and gets their electricity from solar energy, and they're out chasing terrorists and measuring the ocean, doing various environmental things. But basically, there's a couple companies that are developing ocean robots, and it's an example of the dynamism that private sector competition has. Again, China versus Europe. You know, the history of exploration, National Geographic Society was an organization that funded exploration of the Earth, of the North and South Pole, Africa. Basically, wealthy people, subscribers, would pay money, and an explorer would come to the National Geographic Society with a proposal for doing some exploration. If he had enough donors and funders who would sign on and the society would support him, he'd go off and do the exploration and come back and report it. And it was funded again by eccentric rich people funding eccentric explorers. And that was the way much of the Earth was explored through history. And of course, our space race later with the US government versus the Soviet government in getting to the moon. There's two recent articles in Forbes about this sort of entrepreneurship and innovation. And the key turns out to be mid-sized companies. Ocean Robotics is a mid-sized company with a team of people to achieve a result. And the teamwork and the size and the scale is part of the success. We have a similar story in the pharmaceutical industry. Turns out the giant pharmaceutical companies are not nearly as effective in finding new technologies, effective drugs. It turns out time and again it's mid-sized, team-sized companies that are achieving the progress, and then they get bought out by large companies. That's partly because the FDA makes it so expensive to get new drugs approved. But the Forbes article on that, called Serial Lifesaver, if you're searching for it, tells that story. In each of these stories, it's a question of advancing technology, exploring the frontiers, The one case, the frontiers in the ocean, the other frontiers in pharmaceuticals, and the way that small companies competing pushes things ahead better than a central top-down approach, whether it's a giant private company or a large government. You have the history of the Zheng Ho, basically the Chinese eunuch who pushed massive exploration of the ocean with tribute fleets, centrally done, vastly expensive, incredibly successful. These boats were bigger than anything that the West had by far. They went through the out from China down through the Indian Ocean. They were a stunning success. Some people claim they circumnavigated the world, although evidence for that is sketchy. In any case, the top-down program was funded as a way to gain tribute and impress the world, and they brought back, giraffes and elephants and all sorts of things that the emperor was impressed with for a while, but it turned out to be too expensive. Instead of having a trade-based system that generated revenue as part of the exploration, it turned out to bankrupt the Chinese government. It was eventually stopped. The boats were destroyed, and it led to a disaster, an implosion of Chinese civilization. So, problem there. Who explores the Earth and why? Well, underground, there's associations, the National Caves Association. Basically, people who care about caves, who like going deep in the Earth, they go explore caves all around the country, all around the world. Exploration of the Earth. So exploration, you can only go up, sideways, or down, and the cave people go down. The National Speleological Society. Maybe these people are crazy. I can't imagine. It doesn't seem exciting to me, but it is for them. But they fund it because it's enjoyable. They like it. So some people go rock climbing, some people climb Mount Everest. These people explore caves, and you can obviously find out more on Discovery Channel specials and so forth. But you don't need a federal government program to explore the Earth. Instead, exploration happens by interested people who have money in a wealthy society to do that. Here's a company interested in space exploration. This is DIY airship sets altitude record. This is a small company that basically wants to get into space with balloons. They say take a light craft, put some converted weather satellite balloons on it, and you can lift yourself up into space very inexpensively. With some development of the technology, you can have small rockets that could do further exploration, but the idea is to get up there inexpensively so you can explore. Who explores the sky? This is their craft. JP Aerospace, their airship to orbit product. They basically say they can get crafts above the atmosphere, and then it's much cheaper. Basically, instead of spending hundreds of millions of dollars to get into space, they spent about $30,000 over 5 years to develop their first space exploration vehicle. Now, whether it got beyond the Earth's mesosphere, as the topic requires, you have to look into. But the core is, when you realize with rockets, 90% of the cost is raising the fuel out of the gravity well of Earth. So if balloons can do it much cheaper, then you get your exploration craft above the atmosphere before you have to, you don't have to power your way up through the atmosphere. You use balloons to do it.